Welcome into the Devil Source Postgame show. That's Chris Cartman. I'm Ethan Ryder. Following ASU's humiliating 30-21 loss at Sun Devil Stadium against Eastern Michigan. Chris, it was a humiliating one. It was a bad performance, but just what are your initial takeaways?
I didn't think ASU was going to be a particularly good football team this year, and even with that being the case and all the challenges that have gone on in the program over the last year, did not expect to see anything like that tonight. That was the worst performance that I can remember seeing from an ASU team in a non-conference home game in my career covering the program. Worse even than the 2008 loss to UNLV, which was sort of a precursor to 3 bad years of Dennis Erickson football, really. And I don't know really where you go from here. I think that there's just a lot of obvious problems, including some that I didn't anticipate. I didn't even think that ASU getting blown off the football and totally destroyed with its defensive line was going to be an issue in this game against this team. Eastern Michigan was picked 5th in the MAC West. It's not a very good football team. Gave up 49 points in one half to Louisiana. I thought ASU was going to win by. I thought ASU was going to cover the spread. You lose at home by as a 20.5 point favorite by 9 points in a game in which you were clearly not as good as your opponent. You use the word humiliating. I just think that it's an utter failure of this coaching staff, and there's just nothing really redeemable about it whatsoever.
And when you speak about the coaching staff, you asked Herm after the game specifically, was it coaching? What did he say to that regard, and just kind of what does it mean based off of what he said?
His tendency has been to deflect. Previous coaches that we've seen at ASU have said it starts with me. It's my fault. I didn't have them ready. Herm Edwards doesn't say that. He always says, I told them. He did it again tonight. I told them, it's a physical football team. They're a good football team. Look, it comes down to your preparation. It doesn't matter what, telling people whatever you want to say. It comes down to, do you get them ready? And if they aren't ready, that's your responsibility, and you have to take ownership of it. I don't think he does that enough, point blank. I think it's pretty disappointing to, if you're a fan of ASU and you see your team lose a game like this in a half-empty stadium at home, to then have the coach say, I think it's everything. I'm sorry, it's your coaching primarily that is responsible. There was many instances of that throughout this game, throughout last season when they were the most penalized team in Power 5 football, and there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever at this point that coaching has held this program back during the Herm Edwards era.
And a lot of this stems from the fact that they got absolutely ran over in the first half by Eastern Michigan. What did you see from that? Why was it so easy for Eastern Michigan to run the ball?
Hard to say, but I saw 300 yards of total offense by a not even good football team. 145, 150 yards roughly, or whatever it was, rushing. ASU at one point, well, for most of the game, in fact, had to take its 3-technique tackle off the field because Omar Norman Lott and BJ Green weren't being successful. We saw nested Jade Silvera getting blown off the ball on double teams. There was just huge holes, and you knew that they were going to run the ball inside every time. Even after the team's first-string quarterback went down with an injury, second-string quarterback comes in, no problem, still running it all around. He was even more mobile, maybe caused him some issues with the zone read. How about loading up the box? How about playing man coverage, press man, and trying to take them away and getting 9 guys up in there? I don't understand. I've been very complimentary of Robert Rodriguez throughout his tenure at ASU as defensive line coach and someone who has his group really prepared on a week-to-week basis. But he bears some responsibility for this. It is a week after a game in which his position group had 3 15-yard penalties for hitting quarterbacks late and stuff like that. And then tonight, you saw they got just absolutely run off the football, and they didn't fix it with any of their alignments. They didn't fix their gap integrity. Totally inexcusable.
And I mean, Herm even talked about gap responsibility during the game in his press conference. But switching over to the other side of the ball, a couple shot play opportunities that they weren't able to hit on. Was that something that should kind of be worrisome for the rest of the season, or what did you see from that?
They need some of those. I said in my sort of preview for this game, Eastern Michigan's secondary was pretty weak in its perimeter defenders. Anytime they had to play in some man coverage situations where they had to move up and play at the line of scrimmage, they struggled. They got run by. ASU had 3 opportunities for touchdowns that were drops and or throws that were just a little bit off the mark. There was the Zeke Freeman one, slightly long, off his hands. Elijah Badger had a missed opportunity touchdown that was maybe thrown a little bit too far outside of where it should have been. Then there was an overthrow that was targeting Geo Sanders, right? So that's 3 possible touchdowns. ASU could have used all those points. They ended up with 21 in the game, right? So there's a bunch of extra points that they left out there, and those things also have the ability to kind of get defenses on their heels, change momentum. But I also think, really, Ethan, that this was a game that ASU could have done RPO 30 times and then run the ball inside, inside run, and they would have been able to move the football quite easily, and didn't have nearly as many offensive yards as I thought they should have in this game.
Yeah, and another thing that really contributed today, last season, big story this season was penalties. It seemed like the first game against NAU, maybe there was a little bit of a change there. Oklahoma State, 10 penalties. We don't know the exact amount from this game because of some problems with the stats and reading and being able to read that type of stuff. But there was problems today, and it almost felt like deja vu. And it was every time they got a first down, it seemed to get called back for hold.
They had undisciplined penalties, several unsportsmanlikes. They had holdings in critical situations. They moved themselves back. When you're trailing 10 points or 13 points or whatever, and you're in 1st and 15, 2nd and 20 situations, you're not going to be able to win. And so I just think that the discipline, the attention to detail, and the situational awareness all are not where they need to be with this team. That's coaching. Coaching is what ultimately determines if you have those things or you don't have those things. And they came in weird situations. They had a penalty after a 1-minute delay for a player injury before halftime. They had other penalties that came after other sort of delays. It was weird. They were late with substitutions in situations. They struggled to get guys on and off the field at times to try to match up. Just their operation wasn't good. 3rd game of the season, not good enough.
And speaking of operation, game management was a problem. You were talking about there were times where the whole defensive line was getting swapped out at the end of the first half. There was a timeout called on the 4th down. What was game manager like from your point of view?
Not good. Super perplexing what happened before halftime. They had 2 timeouts. They're down 10 points. They get the ball back, and they're slow. Like between their 2nd and 3rd down play, they took several seconds before they even got lined up, ran a play, didn't convert it, and then Herm Edwards took a timeout on 4th and 1, which preceded them punting. Like they could have just run the clock out. Eastern Michigan had no timeouts left in the half. They wouldn't have had to punt. But by taking a timeout, then you have to get the punt off. You run the risk of having a return on you. Edwards said after the game that he thought that ASU had a first down. Well, if you have a good process, you have somebody in the booth who's on the headset telling you we got a first down, then you take the timeout. You don't take the timeout guessing whether or not you had a first down. It doesn't work like that. The second half, they took 2 timeouts in non-offensive situations when they were trailing. What if they needed those timeouts in a 2-minute situation at the end of the game? One of those came after some stoppage of play that should never happen. Like that, there's just things that you can't have happen, and this is against a bad opponent, right? Well, how are you going to beat good opponents? It's probably not going to happen.
And we've talked about a lot of negatives. It was a bad performance, but are there any positives to be taken away from this?
Look, I think Xavier Valadez showed once again that he's a very good player. I think ASU didn't give up a lot of passes behind the defense. That's pretty consistently been the case. Too many balls caught in front of their defensive backs. And there were some issues. Again, Tamarcus Davis, I think he struggled in spots, and safeties have played reasonably well overall. But Emory Jones, I feel like he's pretty close. You know, he's not good enough right now, but he's close to breaking out, and they needed it tonight. But again, there was a couple throws he missed on. He didn't get enough help from his receivers. But, man, there's not a lot of positives. Eastern Michigan punted one time tonight. Eddie Chaplitsky, ASU's punter, puts the ball out of bounds in the first kickoff, which then leads to Jace Feely being their kickoff guy the rest of the game, I guess.
I think Chaplitsky ended up kicking some more. Because Feely kicked, and it went to the 8-yard line.
Oh, yes.
Without fair caught. Correct.
And then, DJ Taylor, we haven't really seen anything from him as a return man. Elijah Badger, he continues to make some strides. And by the way, when you get the ball to him in space on some of these screens and hitches, he can go make some guys miss and make some big plays. And so, look, you got to get. And Daniel Ngata ran well in his opportunities.
He actually returned a couple. I don't know if it was by purpose or it just ended up going to his side, but he ended up returning pretty well on kickoffs.
I agree. So look, you got to get the ball. If you're ASU, it's like, how do we get the ball to Valladay? And they threw some screens to him. They didn't do it all against Oklahoma State, but how do you get the ball to Valladay and Ngata, Badger, as much as you possibly can, and then maybe try to get Messiah Swinson more involved on some of these RPOs. They haven't been able to. I think Geo Sanders is probably underutilized, but not very many positives.
Now, after the game, more kind of big picture. We've talked about this before, but after the game, you took a video of Herm Edwards talking to Ray Anderson and Michael Crow. Didn't look like the greatest of conversations to be having.
Awkward.
But where do you go from here? Is it possible they go from here without Herm Edwards, or what are your views on that situation?
Good question. I think Ray Anderson, his pride and wanting to be perceived a certain way at the end of his twilight of his career is not going to lead to him deciding to fire Herm Edwards. I think it would take more losses and things really getting ugly before that would happen. Herm Edwards, I read his lips. It was when he came over and talked to Ray Anderson and Michael Crow. Edwards said, "We got our butts kicked." First thing he said, and then after that, it was kind of terse. Michael Crow wasn't really looking at him too much. Ray Anderson had a very sort of resigned look on his face at the conclusion of their conversation. I think that the realization has finally hit these guys that all of the talk and the bluster and the aspirations and the NFL model and yada yada hasn't really gotten them anywhere, definitely not anywhere close to what Anderson set out as expectations for the program prior to his decision to hire Herm Edwards. So I don't think that there's going to be any change now. They have an extremely difficult schedule coming up that we've talked about, right? Utah here in a week. Dominated today, looked like a juggernaut. Much better team than ASU, much better coach team than ASU. I don't know how anybody's going to pick ASU to win that game. Then ASU has to go on the road to play at USC. That's scary. I mean, that's a game that easily could be a 30, 40-point loss. No way that you can imagine ASU is going to win that game. And then ASU has to play Washington, which looked really good in a win over Michigan State. So you have to think about what are the most likely records for ASU at the midpoint of its season this year. 1-5 and 2-4. Those are the two most likely. The back end of ASU's schedule is a little bit easier, but by no means easy, right? Oregon State, that's tough, even here. Washington,
60-plus points today.
Washington State on the road in November, that's tough. Stanford, at Stanford, that's tough. So other than Colorado on the road, there's no gimmies, and this thing could get ugly. It very possibly could get ugly. And it already is ugly tonight.
Certainly, it could get uglier, is what you're basically saying.
It could get hideous.
It could get hideous. And before we leave, on this note, we've talked about it before on our podcast. 6-6 was what was looking like likely. Is it back to 5-7? Is it lower than 5-7?
Well,
What are you thinking?
Yeah, I think we were kind of between 5-7 and 6-6, and you said, okay, well, not you, but anyone thought, okay, the 2 wins are obvious at the front end of your non-conference schedule, and then there's Colorado, and Arizona. Now Arizona's playing a little bit better. It's not a gimme. After ASU's stinker tonight, who knows? How many games will ASU be favored the rest of the way? 1 or 2, maybe.
Maybe.
Right? So I really saw ASU as being somewhere between a 4 and 7 win team a vast majority of the time. And now clearly it looks like it's probably going to be on the lower end of that range. And you can't rule out a 2 or 3 win season. You can't rule it out at this point. And that is surprising, definitely, for me to say that, because and really, even when you watched ASU play against NAU or even Oklahoma State in large stretches, you thought, okay, still looks like a team that could be pretty competitive in the conference. Today was absolutely atrocious. There's recency bias is always a factor, right? Like you remember things more recently, prominently compared to things that happened 20 years ago or whatever. But I don't remember ASU losing a game that felt this bad, to where they just got totally dismantled, really, by an FCS opponent in Sun Devil Stadium. I just don't. I'll have to go back and look at it, but I don't think that that's happened in the last few decades.
Well, the story of the game is it was ugly, and you wonder, is this an outlier for the season? And when you look into the future, you wonder, could it get hideous? ASU humiliating 30-21 loss to Eastern Michigan at home at Sun Devil Stadium. Make sure to stay tuned to all of our content as ASU now stays at home to take on Utah, which should be a tough one, before USC and then Washington, as we just stated. But for now, that's it for this edition of the Sun Devil Source Postgame Show. That's Chris Cartman. I'm Ethan Ryder. We'll see you guys next time.